I should say good afternoon, right? Or right afternoon. This is a little different because this is not my home. I think it's my home away from home. My name is Carl Meacham. Yeah, perfect. Perfect. My name is Carl Meacham, and I am the director of the CSIS Americas program. I'm very happy to be here co-hosting today's event entitled Why is Chile in Such a Bad Mood? With my good friend Peter Schechter. Peter's done such a great job building the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center here, and it's been great to work with you on this issue, but on so many other issues that we've cooperated on. I'm particularly grateful to Peter for asking me to introduce Chile's ambassador to the U.S., His Excellency Juan Gabriel Valdez. He's one of Chile's finest representatives. I met him years ago when he was leading basically the efforts of reconstruction and other things for the UN in Haiti. And he's done such a wonderful job in those things and other things. Today in the morning, I actually bumped into him in some interesting circumstances. I was biking into work, and he was in this beautiful, Lincoln ambassadorial car. And he looked at me, and I looked at him, and he's like, who the hell is that guy? He rolled the window down, and we said hello. But I'm really excited to be here, also with Eugenio Tironi and Felipe Larraín, who are going to be talking later. Before we get to them, I'm going to give you just some context on what we're going to be talking about, what I think will be a great discussion today. As you know, we're here to talk about Chile, and specifically what is going on there. Recently, Chile's been in the news a lot, and it hasn't been for the best reasons. There have been natural disasters, floods in the north, volcanic eruptions in the south, fires in central Chile, and there's been some political upheaval as well. There's a really common idiom in Chile, más golpeado que membrillo colegial, more beat up than a quince in a kid's school bag. Now, how many of you eat quinces? You don't. But in Chile, membrillos are something that we all used to eat. But anyway, so Chile's going through a tough situation. This comes as a bit of a surprise to a lot of people, I'd say, and for good reason. Usually Chile is hailed as an example to follow for other countries in the Americas, but also for similar economies around the world. I'm going to take a little bit to unpack what Chile's recent challenge so we're all on the same page before we get to the ambassador. It's interesting you put me in this situation. I have to be very careful. I don't want to say anything that's going to make my half ambassador angry. So I'm going to be very delicate in how and what my remarks are today. So what's going on with Chile? Chile is known for being arguably the most stable country in South America, though like many of its regional neighbors, modern Chile is in some ways the product of decades of dictatorship. The country has risen above its earlier challenges. The political system is stable. The economy is reliably robust. Chile is considered a high-income country or economy by the World Bank. Chile leads Latin American competitiveness, income per capita, globalization, and economic freedom. Economic growth has been reliably high over the past few years, averaging over 5%. Unemployment hovers just above 6%. The U.S. is 5.5%. So according to broadly accepted economic criteria for several years now, Chile's been doing pretty well. But more recently, we've seen Chile face a growing set of problems on the political front. To be fair, it's easy for these problems to appear to pale in comparison to issues troubling some in Chile's neighborhood. The political unrest and human rights situation in Venezuela, the violence and transnational crime in the Northern Triangle countries in Central America, the corruption and migration issues in Brazil, corruption, Argentina, migration crisis in Mexico. These are big deal issues, but Chile's facing real challenges too. And most are focused on a common theme recently, which has been corruption. Most of this has come to light through a series of three major scandals: Penta, Cabal, and Soquimich. The three have something important in common. They involve companies or individuals using clever financial schemes to garner political favor, often by financing electoral campaigns, at times by providing advantages to individuals in positions of power. The one gaining the most attention at the moment is the Cabal scandal, which involves the head of Chile's the Bank of Chile, and also the president's only son. In summary, just a few days before the president was elected in 2013, her son obtained a $10 million loan from the Bank of Chile after meeting with the bank's head. President Chile has denied any connection to this transaction, and it hasn't been demonstrated that there's any involvement by the president, but it hasn't stopped from Chileans from speculating that this corruption scandal could go all the way to the top. Penta is similarly important. The scandal involves several officials, most of whom served under President Piñera, and alleges that they received illegal campaign finances. Loosely speaking, what Penta means for the right, Cabal has meant for the left, at least in terms of exposing corruption. Together, they show that corruption is not a problem unique to the political right or left in Chile. Rather, it is one endemic in the political elite. It's important to keep in mind here, too, that these corruption scandals aren't as far-reaching as, for example, the ongoing Petrobras scandal in Brazil. Chileans fundamentally fear that what we're seeing now may be just the tip of the iceberg nevertheless. And that's the root of so much of the unease and distrust so prevalent in Chile at the moment. And a little bit to the answer of your question of why Chileans are so gruñones, they're so much in a bad mood. Ultimately, all of this is to say that while Chile has largely been seen as the stable and prosperous golden child, perceptions no longer quite appear to match reality. Perhaps the most weighty ill effect of everything that's going on in this situation is a crisis in confidence among the Chilean population. Decreasingly trusting of the government, a distrust that extends beyond President Bachelet herself, right and left, Chileans are looking once again for meaningful change. What that change could be or where that change could come from is anyone's guess, but I tend to think that it is sort of a challenge, one that generates distrust in established institutions and the political elite that can so quickly breed a resurgence of populist policies. What that resurgence could be for Chile in the long run, I'm not sure. It could go either way, but Chile's history is a reminder that popular frustrations can lead to failed political experiments. Whatever the case, the country, even so recently lauded as the region's most stable and prosperous economy, is inching closer and closer to political crisis. And until it strengthens its political institutions, restores confidence in government, and ensures that rule of law applies to all the country's citizens equally, Chile will continue to struggle. The crisis is the result of bad institutional design. Campaigns start months before the official start date. Thus, campaign spending is going on long before candidates are officially allowed to spend and to raise funds. The practices that are now being investigated have been going on for years. Everybody knew about them, but nobody wanted to better regulate campaign financing. Ultimately, many have started to wonder what this means for the president. Is she done? I don't think she's done. Bachelet's not done by a long shot. The Chilean system is deeply presidentialist. Power in Chile is more concentrated in the president than, let's say, the United States. As a result of the poor handling of these scandals, nevertheless, Bachelet's problem is that she is not perceived as being as strong as what she was just a year ago when she started. It's not institutional weakness which is the issue. The day she moves forward and exercises her leadership, she will be able to regain her political strength. Her own legacy as president depends on it. This is a political scandal, not an institutional scandal. Politicians are being questioned, not Chile's democratic system. If anything, these scandals have shown that the prosecutor's office is independent and strong. The way out for the prosecutor's investigation to move forward with this situation is not to interfere and for the problem to be dealt with in a sustainable way for a long-term solution. There are municipal elections in 2016 and presidential and legislative elections in 2017. There's ample time to fix these problems. So briefly, that's what we're here to talk about today. I hope I've shaken the tree a little bit to have a very sort of productive conversation, one that's meaningful and helps to or enable folks that are listening to understand a little bit better what's happening in Chile. I'm thrilled to introduce the ambassador here now, His Excellency Juan Gabriel Valdés. Ambassador Valdés is a political scientist and former Chilean foreign minister. He's an accomplished diplomat, an excellent emissary of Chile here in the United States. It's my pleasure to turn the stage over to him now for his opening remarks as we continue in this wonderful panel. Thank you so much. Yep.
Well, I want to thank Peter Schechter and the Adrienne Arsht Latin American Center of the Atlantic Council and Carl Meacham in our second meeting this morning from the Center of Strategic and International Studies for organizing this discussion about Chile and its bad mood. Ambassadors are not supposed to inaugurate forums designed to criticize their own countries. As Michel de Montaigne, the greatest of diplomats, once said, we have to transmit even the cruelest truth to our masters, but be mild and exercise le bon jugement when describing our country to foreigners, even at the Atlantic Council. Yet it is my impression that he would agree today that globalization and the New York Times doesn't give us much choice. In today's world, even ambassadors have to recognize when their countries are going through a difficult time. In any case, I'm sure le bon jugement is going to be applied this morning. Bad mood is an adequate concept. Chile is in a terrible bad mood, but not, in my view, in an institutional crisis, in a social crisis, or in an economic crisis. The president is going through a difficult moment, but what the society wants is for her to exert her authority, not to leave the camp. Congress is going through a very critical experience. The political class is crossing a sea of accusation and mistrust, but what people demand is a better Congress, a more transparent body of legislators, and institutions are working. The judiciary is examining the accusations that have exploded around scandals based on the financement of elections, and there is a broad political agreement that laws have to be changed. Penalties for crossing the threshold of the law have to be increased. A presidential commission conformed by academics and experts, not by politicians, mind you, from the entire ideological spectrum, is going to make proposal next April 24th, guiding a constitutional reform that will most probably limit the expenditure of campaigns, limit private donations, and increase public contributions to political parties. It will also probably penalize those members of Congress who violate electoral laws with the loss of their seats. Yet, the accusations have hurt the government and the president. They have hurt the prestige of Congress, already low for a long time, as well as the prestige of the business sector. For most Chileans, the credibility of the elite has been destroyed. Indeed, mistrust and indignation with the elite seem to go beyond the electoral area. Chile is going through a period of generalized denunciation of abuso. It would seem as if the entire middle class produced by the extraordinary and celebrated transformation that Chile experienced during the last 25 years had insurrected against the ways and mores of the elite, of the businesses elite, of the political elite that conducted the transition to democracy, of the religious elites, of the elites in the media. In other countries, but also in other moments of our history, these phenomena have opened the possibility of populism, seriously threatening democracy. I don't think this will be the Chilean case. We know that at this time, we have to assume responsibility for allowing this situation to develop, channeling public indignations through profound institutional reforms. What is happening in Chile is not limited to us. Spain, Mexico, and Brazil, to name some of them, are experiencing phenomena not totally distant from the Chilean one. When we look at these cases from a broader sociological perspective, we realize that there is a lot more to understand, a lot more to analyze. We have today two remarkable Chileans to discuss this issue. Felipe Larraín is one of the top economists in the country, the former Minister of Finances during the previous government of Sebastián Piñera. He belongs to the school of economists who do not elude social and political analysis and debate. Eugenio Tironi is the most relevant analyst and sociologist in the country. His analysis of the Chilean transition and of the effects in Chilean society have international resonance. I'm sure this will be an excellent debate, and I'm very happy to be here today. I thank once again the Atlantic Council and the CSIS for organizing and preparing this presentation. Thank you very much.
Felipe aquí, tú allá. Great, welcome everybody. Thanks very much. I'm Peter Schechter. I'm the director of the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center here at the Atlantic Council. And you're going to have to forgive me a totally personal word today, because 26 years ago, I was a new, recently hired political consultant, and I went with a guy who was my boss, a man called Mark Malloch Brown, and we went to Chile, where I met two extraordinary Chileans. One is Eugenio Tironi, and the other one is Juan Gabriel Valdés. When we were on a mission to perhaps all jointly to perhaps professionalize the NO's campaign that was upcoming. And then Mark and I were honored to be able to work with both of you on the No campaign, which was an amazing experience. A blow by blow of that experience has been written by a number of people, and you've seen the movie of it. I think the best book about it was written by Eugenio himself. But it's a real pleasure for me, because I've seen Eugenio a number of times throughout the years. I've seen Juan Gabriel a number of times throughout the years, but I've never been with them together since that time. So it's truly a great pleasure, and it's a great pleasure to have you, Minister, here. We didn't know each other, but it's an enormous pleasure to have you. Minister Larraín is not only, as Ambassador Valdés said, is not only the former finance minister, but also called the best finance minister in Latin America by a number of publications that are of great prestige, The Banker, Emerging Markets, et cetera, et cetera. So really, it's a great pleasure. Thank you for coming and joining us. You know, I'm not going to do a lot of overview here. I think between the ambassador and my friend Carl, we've talked a lot about the overview. I mean, this event has a cute name, and that's great. And you know, I think in essence, just to put it, here's what I see in Chile. I mean, we had 25 years of concertación, which was about, let's say, really being simplistic, was about three things: returning power to democratic discourse, empowering civil society, free press, dialogue. It was about maintaining the essence of strong, conservative economic management, and about investing in social goods, infrastructure, education, and healthcare. All of that brought Chile incredible success, as our two speakers have said. But for the last years, Chile seems to be flailing. In 2010, the government of Sebastián Piñera won a huge electoral landslide. And presumably the message, again, forgive me the simplicity, was we have enough of caution. It's time to supercharge the Chilean economic machine. And I would say the three things were making government smaller and more efficient, liberating the private sector from burdensome regulations and taxes, and letting the free market produce the growth that Chile needed to create jobs and prosperity. Then 4 years later, Michelle Bachelet wins with a huge electoral market to try to repeal that overly free market principles. And so we got a torrent of redistribution-intended reforms, education reform, labor reform, tax reform, and today the president is at the lowest level. We've heard about the corruption scandals. So, gentlemen, I guess the first question I have for you is, what's going on? I mean, Chile seems to swing one way, then swings another way. And, you know, it seems to us from outside of Chile that there are 17 million Don Quixotes that are looking for their Dulcinea, but they can never seem to find exactly what it is they want. So to both of you, and perhaps I'll begin with Eugenio, why are Chileans so unhappy?
You know, I don't think Chileans are unhappy. If you look at the surveys, or this, for instance, this World Happiness Report, Chile is number 28 between 150 countries. The US is 17. So I don't think Chileans are really unhappy. Who is unhappy is the ruling class, but that's different. And I think the ruling class is unhappy because, well, society is not moving in the direction they want. And that happened to Piñera, and that is happening to Bachelet. It's a much more complex society that doesn't obey easily to the government or to the elites. Secondly, the ruling class is being accountable for the first time probably since the colonization of Chile. And it's being treated as any Chilean by the prosecutors, by the press, by the judges. And that makes you unhappy. And the reputation, the authority, the legitimacy of the ruling class is being questioned. And this is something that, as I said, makes people unhappy. But Chileans, they change also their expectations. Nowadays, the expectation is not access. Don't matter in what condition. I think the expectation today is to put an end to the unjustified privilege. That I would say that's the main goal of this medium class. The problem is with a ruling system that's too oligarchic for a democratic society. That's it.
So I know we have a panel that agrees on everything, so I'm going to let you agree on that.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Pleasure to be here, Peter. Ambassador Valdés, when he started his comments, he was very clever because he gave a warning that he would, refrain himself from criticizing his country, but then he looked at us, and I thought the warning was for me. So thank you, Ambassador. Thank you very much. Anyway, I think that I would, grossly agree, generally agree what has been said. There is I would put it in different words, though. First of all, unhappy, I would point to a couple of additional indicators to the ones that Eugenio mentioned, which is general happiness indicator. The country that, best country to be born in Latin America was Chile. Best country to grow old in a recent survey was Chile. So we cannot be unhappy. We're happy to be born and grow old in a country, Who is unhappy to So I think that was an interesting couple of indicators for me. Second, rather than saying unhappy, I would say part of what's happening is a mix of two forces. It's the mix of, first of all, the so-called middle income trap. When you were referring, or I think Carl was referring that we are a high income country, only according to a statistical ranking of the World Bank, but according to the IMF, for example, we're not. We're a higher middle income country, because even if our GDP per capita was revised recently, according to particularly on PPP terms, purchasing power parity terms, we cannot be considered a high income country. We're still a higher middle income country, aiming to become a developed nation. And I think what's happening here is that, as in many countries, people start to say, well, we're doing better, and where is my part of the piece? And I want to have a lot of rights, and I don't want to have many duties. So I want to have part of some of the students' movement has been preached under the free education for everyone. So free education, which is one of the things that this government took, which I completely disagree, free higher education. We can talk about that later. But, this is something that is extremely expensive, and it's regressive. So you're not going to promote more income equality. You're not going to reduce income inequality by promoting free education, because right now, 90% of the Chilean population have access to subsidized loans or grants. So we're really talking about the 10% that comes after that. But I think, not to deviate from the subject, I think it's really the birth of this country that is coming to be on the way to development. And I would point to a statistic which is very complicated. In 1965, there were about 100, something countries, 100 and few countries labeled as developing, by the World Bank. Right now, only less than 10%. Less than 10 of those countries are developed. So the issue is that when you are 50 years later, and half a century later, many countries that are on the path to development get derailed. And I strongly hope that my country, which we all love here, all Chileans love our country, that is not one of the countries that get derailed from this process. The second fact, we think that's one point. The second point, to me, is that Chileans will not tolerate privilege and unjustified privilege. Alexis Sanchez, which you probably know, is one of the Chileans, from the Arsenal. He's a soccer player, as a best-known soccer player. He makes millions of dollars. Well, he's a privileged guy because of his talent, but nobody will challenge his privileges. But unjustified privileges. Society reacts in a way that does not tolerate, that people sort of bypass the laws, and we're very tough on that. And this, I think, the country has become more demanding on that way. Society has become more demanding. And I think that's part of what's happening. They won't tolerate it in the private sector. They won't tolerate it with the son of the president. And I think, the issue is that, and what has, on my view, hurt importantly the government, but I would agree that we're a presidential country, and all this idea that president, there was on the papers, and she even said, I won't resign. Of course, I would say she should not. She's the president of the country. She should lead. It is her responsibility to do that. Although I'm in the opposition, but she's my president, and he's my ambassador. So, we have to move, this country together and get over this tremendous obstacle.
So we'll get to education and impunity, but I wanted to stay a second with another issue that both of you mentioned, and Eugenio and I were talking about that before you came, Minister, which is this issue of inequality. It's an issue, we're talking about it in the United States, in Europe. This is an issue that permeates a lot of the political discussions all over the world. And Chile is an OECD country, but in terms of equality, it's at the low level of OECD. So, Eugenio, why do you see, and it's also obviously clearly one of the president's banners. So why is Chile so unequal, and what can be done to try to fix it?
Well, I think that inequality in Chile and in Latin America is rooted in the way the way it was colonized by the Spaniards. This is something that a guy called Centeno remarked a lot of years ago, and now Fukuyama also went to it in his last book. And Spaniards didn't kill the Indians, but the legacy was inequality. And why inequality persists? I will say that because we haven't had social pressure for equality, at least in the last years. The focus, as I said before, was on access, not on equality. But now it's different. And that's the main thing that's happening in Chile. We all know since Tocqueville that when people become wealthy and more educated, they are less tolerant with inequality. And inequality is not only about my part in the cake, it's about respect. It's about justice. And this is what's happening today in Chile. And we all know that market creates growth, but doesn't create equality. And Chile is the most market-oriented society in the planet, maybe. And it was protected, and this system is protected by an institutional architecture that subsidizes the right, the pro-market political actors, that puts a lot of obstacles to institutional change, to constitutional changes, and promotes a huge influence of money on politics. That was the system, that was a system built to protect, I will say, inequality. So why inequality persists in Chile? Because of politics, not economics. Forgive me, Carville. Is politics stupid? Specifically, is power stupid? And I think that's what in Chile is changing today in these hours. The distribution of power, of symbolic power, political power, institutional power, and this is what makes us, the powerful people, feel so unhappy.
So this is a question for a finance minister. I mean, clearly one of the administration's answers to inequality has been to create a tax reform that has been sort of redistributive in nature. And is that an effective way to combat this problem of Chilean inequality? And are there other things that the administration ought to be doing?
Well, let me put things in perspective, because we're here talking about, the most unequal country in the OECD. According to latest data, that's not the case. The most unequal country is Mexico, by a small margin, but it is. Our Gini coefficient, for those of you who are, into this kind of jargon, it's 49.1, which is significantly above the OECD average, which is 35, but Mexico is 49.2. And I can name 7 countries in Latin America which are more unequal than Chile. Started by Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Panama, Paraguay, Costa Rica, and the Dominican Republic. So, I mean, let's be a little bit in perspective. Chile is not, some people say, because they want to extrapolate and exacerbate this issue, that Chile is the most unequal country in the world. No, that's not the case. It is wrong to say that. Chile, I'm not saying we have a level of inequality that we should be content with. I'm just saying, let's start first with the facts. The facts are that in Latin America, the most unequal region in the world, partly because of the reasons that Eugenio was mentioning, in the colonial heritage and the encomienda and the mayorazgo are 2 of the most important institutions that started with inequality. But, so in this situation, what has happened in Chile? So first of all, on the level of inequality, on the trend, since 2000, there's been a reduction of inequality in Chile, with the exception of the period 2006-2009, which is the previous administration of President Bachelet. That's the only period where we haven't had a reduction of inequality, but you count all the governments from 2000 to 2013, and you have a reduction of inequality. Not a huge reduction, but if you started around 2000, our Gini was around 56. Now it's around 49. It's not a huge, but it's a sustained improvement. So I would say we are, slightly improving on inequality, less than we would like to. What I would disagree with the government on this issue is that because their statements and their political base is so preached on the issue of inequality that they hide the fact that inequality has improved in Chile. And we should be telling people what is happening. Is that, yes, we are an unequally distributed income in our society, but we've been making some improvement. That poverty, we've been able to have the lowest poverty rate by far in Latin America, with 7.8% of the population, and that we had one of the greatest reductions in poverty in Chile over the last 4 years. This was on their cassette. We should be all celebrating. Well, the government decided to postpone and then, publicize this statistic on a Saturday afternoon, and there was it pretty much went, unnoticed, this tremendous achievement of the Chilean society. So I want to put things on perspective, and then on your question on the tax reform. We did 2 tax reforms. So when someone said, well, that we were low government and lower taxes, actually we increased taxes during the Piñera administration for 2 reasons. First, because we had to go and finance the earthquake. So part of that was financed by tax reform. Second, because we wanted to provide $1 billion additional to education. And during our period, the scholarships for higher education increased from 120,000 to 360,000. And the cost of the interest rate on a credit on a loan, on a higher education loan, declined from 6 to 2%. So now it's subsidized. But whether this tax reform will increase equality, they will reduce inequality? Absolutely not. It has not only been a reform that is one of the major responsibles because of why the Chilean economy has not stopped. We're not in an economic crisis, we're not in a recession, but we have had a hard landing in terms of growth. Growth last year was 1%, and we are now growing at around 2%. And that is a major, deceleration. It's not a soft landing, it's a hard landing. Part of that goes to the tax reform. The tax reform, what it does, and the way it was preached, it was going to be paid by the 1% of the population, highest of the population will pay 95%, 99% of the reform. Then the middle classes in Chile discovered that they will all be paying for the reform. And that's why the reform is now very unpopular. In fact, there's much more people against the tax reform than for it. So the tax reform by itself will not be the way to solve the income distribution because it forgot about the growth on the economy. You need to have growth by itself does not generate more equality, but it helps. If you have adequate government policies, you have growth, and you can distribute and redistribute income in a growing society, in a growing economy. If you have an economy that virtually came to a halt, it's much more difficult. And in terms of conflict, the conflict is much higher if you try to redistribute income in a stagnant country. I'm not saying we're stagnant. I'm just saying there is a very significant reduction in the rate of growth. Let me give you some other, what is the way to, and I would in this way disagree with Eugenio on the fact that this income inequality is purely political. No, because it has a lot to do with education, but not with the kind of things that the education reform is doing. It has to do with the quality of education. It has to do with improving public education and not with killing private education, and part of private education that receives subsidies from the state. A good thing, I try to be optimistic also. When I look at there's a recent research done and looked at income inequality by cohorts in the Chilean society. The young guys have income inequality levels close to the average of the OECD. The older generations have much higher inequality in their income. And that is why is that? Because we've had a major increase in coverage in education, particularly on higher education. Now about 35% of people in that age group go to higher income, higher education institution. So
I want to bring Eugenio in this because you were, maybe I'm misinterpreting, you were looking doubtful. So do you,
Sure.
do you have a,
Sure.
do you have a different view of that? How does one solve what Felipe brings out, which is the growth versus distribution issue? It is a lot easier to have social policies if you're growing, and is the tax reform part of the reason that Chile is not growing now?
No. Inequality is about perceptions, not about the so-called realities. I really don't believe in the causalities of my economist colleagues. The guy who says that tax will have no effect on growth or at the contrary will kill growth, I'm not sure about that. And the first and the best reason is that Felipe Larraín and the Piñera government broke that axioma. They had more taxes and they had more growth. So why, in their case, were able to have growth with taxes, and in this case, we cannot have growth because we have more taxes? I don't agree with this idea that's now a consensus between economists of right and left that the silver bullet to fight inequality is education. I think is the best way to avoid dealing with questions that are much more complicated. Education reflects inequality. It doesn't erase it. I think this last book of Robert Putnam, Our Kids, is incredibly good, showing that families is at the end, and families is at the end the main reason of inequality, and education can't do anything about that. So I don't think there is a silver bullet to deal with inequality. Sure, we must improve education. Sure, we must support families and parenting. We must do a lot of things. But I think the key question is changing the political distribution. The only way to deal with inequality is giving more voice to the people that feel themselves not being treated in an equality way. Not only, as I said before, in terms of economics, but also in terms of other things, as political representation, respect, justice, and so on. So that's the sense. That's the reason why I put an accent on the political
right.
power.
I'm going to give you a minute to finish this inequality. Then I want to move on to the silver bullet, which is education.
Sure. Well, first, let me say, I think my friend Eugenio has a problem with economists in general, you know, not a problem with, you know, but, you know, I won't take, you know, refugee on the fact that probably our predictive power as economists is, you know, significantly better than sociologists, but, you know, that wouldn't be, you know, that would be an interesting discussion. But, you know, Eugenio, leave
it to us political scientists.
You know,
we know what we're doing.
No, you are colonized by the economists now.
But you know, but you see, that's the problem. You said right and left, you know, that's the problem with economists. But I can provide, and it's written on a paper of our center, CLAPES, when we analyzed the tax reform, we provided evidence of about, you know, the 30 most important articles published on the effects of tax reform on investment and growth, and 28 of them, you know, so over 90% said that it was had a negative effect for different countries in different. Of course, the theoretical papers will all say this, you know, because, you know, it's common sense. If you're increasing taxation on corporate tax, you know, it will reduce investment and you will reduce growth, and it's common sense. But the evidence says the same thing. So, I think it's an interesting proposition, Eugenio, and following your academic instinct, I would challenge you to write that paper and show that really improving inequality, meaning reducing inequality, is really a matter of political power. And if you can show that, that would be very interesting as a, you know, it could probably be a revolution, you know, in the way we think about inequality. It's just about giving political power. I think that's, you know, I would disagree with that view, but I will be, you know, as an academic, which is, I've been a minister for 4 years and an academic for 30 years, so basically I'm an academic, so I would be happy to take that, you know, the evidence that can be produced on that respect. The other point is, why we'll be able to grow with tax reform? Well, because we did very moderate tax reforms that were well crafted, you know, and doesn't suffer from the hundreds of technical problems that the current tax reform that was passed in Chile suffers. Interestingly, this tax reform was opposed by all finance ministers. No, we say, well, you opposed it, of course I opposed it. But it was opposed by all finance ministers for concertación. You know, except for the one finance minister that is serving as education minister, that he would have opposed, he would have lost his job as education minister. So the fact that everybody was against, the fact that when we did the tax increase, yes, but we reduced personal income taxes and we reduced taxes on credit. So we took very big care in not to kill growth when we did the tax reform. Growth considerations were totally absent on this reform. I know you.
No. We have.
You know, I get passionate with this.
So Minister Larraín has he has a plane at 2:15, so he needs to leave here at 1:30. So I want to make sure that we cover all the issues.
2:50. If I were at 2:15, I would be leaving right now.
2:50. Sorry. So look, I want to move on to this famous silver bullet, which is education. So, I mean, I think most everybody in the room knows about what has happened in the last couple of years with the education reform. But it just seems to me that nobody is satisfied with the education reform. I mean, the conservative sectors have voiced a lot of strong opposition to the laws. A lot of the student protesters who catalyzed these education reforms have been very unhappy. I mean, it just seems that the government is really caught in the middle here. I mean, is the president just destined to lose? An argument that she really wanted to be hers, but turns out now that she sort of seems to be caught between the rock and the hard place. Eugenio.
Well, I think I must remember that the tax reform was approved by a large majority of the Congress, including the opposition, with their votes. So we are all some responsibility on the effects. Well, but I think that the educational reform that this government present, it had one goal, and that was the decommodification of the educational system. This was also designed by an economist, Aguirre, that thinks like Felipe. So his idea was that if you change the macroeconomics of education, you will improve it. The education is a problem of market regulations, not about education itself. That was his idea, and that was the idea of the projects he presented. And the main goal was to produce a more egalitarian field for kids. And people and voters supported that, and people in the polls supported that. But when you go to the details, and families discovered that a more egalitarian education means that my family must make some compromises and probably must leave private education. People become apprehensive because for them to have access to private education was a sign of status, a very important sign of social mobility. So in that moment, the support for this kind of reforms was destroyed. I like to say that we don't have here the NIMBY effect, but I would say that the don't mess with my family effect. Equality is very good for society, but not if you mess with my family. I think that the government learned the lesson very quickly. At the end, Aguirre transformed the projects. He accepted the critics from the Christian Democratic Party. And I think that the new reforms that are going to be discussed in the next weeks, I hope, about the teacher's career and about the way of managing schools in a regional level, not in a local level, they will be discussed in a very different mood, because also the political climate has changed, and they will try to build a more large consensus. So I am in general optimistic about what's happening in the educational reform. Probably, if it was in my hand, I would not begin with the macroeconomics of education. But you know, economists are always leading in public policies.
All right, I guess I have to give you with that, I have to.
Well, I'm not so optimistic as you are on the education reform. The first thing here with education is that this should have started, and they recognize it now, with public education, by improving public education, by improving the quality of education. But if you tell me that which is the part of the education reform that really addresses the issue of quality, there's nowhere to be found. You know, it's really, you know, something that says, okay, these guys, you cannot receive. It is basically, and I agree with one point that you said. The problem is in the details. When you give the general concept, you may agree or disagree. But then when families realized, for example, that if they wanted to, you're a middle class family in Chile, and you want to send your children to school, and you have these private schools that receive funding from the government, well, these are the ones that will be jeopardized, and probably many of them will not survive. You know, so the families say, okay, you cannot contribute to the education of your children if this is a school that is receiving funds from the state. So you have three types of education institutions in Chile. I'm talking at the primary and secondary level. You have the fully public, only income revenue from the government, the mixed system, and the fully private. So if you're a middle-income family, you say either you go to the fully public or you go to the fully private, which is an immense effort for families who are already making an effort in this mixed system getting funds from the state. If you explain to me the logic that a school cannot receive funds from the state if that you cannot contribute if you're receiving funds from the state, so that the contribution of the families is banned, is banned in this education reform. And then, the education reform started to discuss the issue of buying the schools, buying the infrastructure from these private schools. That was the discussion. And then, if you want to start a new private school of these characteristics, then you need to have the approval of the Ministry of Education. So all this jeopardizes the liberty, the freedom of families to decide where they want to send their children to school. And on top of that, are you an institutano? Instituto Nacional? No. But Instituto Nacional is one of the institutions that is most prestigious, and where many Chilean presidents, have come from. And according to many researchers, what this reform is doing is killing these institutions of the municipal schools, the fully public schools, of excellence, are being killed by this reform. So I'm not so optimistic about what will happen, A few things were changed in the reform when you come with a free education. Free, which is the next, you touched on the on other reforms, the municipal schools, what you do with them, and the career for teachers, the teacher career. But there is another part, which is free education for everyone in higher education. We listen to the OECD. I've seen all the OECD studies. There's no study that really recommends that you do free education at the tertiary level, particularly when you have only 10% of the population that doesn't have access to either a highly subsidized loan or a full grant to study. So it's really, I've been in public debates in Chile, and I say, well, is this for my kids? I have 5 kids, and my wife just decided to go to school again. So I have 6 people at home that are undergoing the education process. And if you're telling me that this is going to be free education for them, it will be very convenient for me, but I don't think it will be fair.
So I want to open it up to questions from the audience, but I want to get to one other question of mine, which is constitutional reform. I mean, this is, for one of the president's, large issues was not only to have constitutional reform, but actually a new constitution altogether. And, I think that she makes a very pertinent argument about the need for a constitution that's born under democracy as opposed to one that was born in the time of Pinochet. So let me begin with you, Felipe. I mean, is this really a national priority? And if it is a national priority, has it been postponed now to the issue of trying to get more economic issues? As you said, Chile is now not growing enough, and so has this discussion about constitution, yes or no, now going to be kicked down the road a bit until Chile's economic growth is back?
Well, my view is the following on the constitutional reform. First of all, we should all be open to improving what we have. So being opposed to constitutional change just for the sake of it, I don't think it's very sensible. But having said that, I think this discussion of the legitimacy of origin, is way out, of touch with the current situation. This constitution has been amended over 30 times since it was first enacted, and the current constitution has the signature of President Lagos and all his cabinet, because that was the big change. So the Constitution, part of the Constitution was born, under the dictatorship. Okay, but then President Lagos, and a full bunch of amendments have what we have now. So the first thing. Second, what is the method? Are we going through the institutions? If it's true that we have the institutional, we're going to respect our institutions in our country, then we should go through the institutional way to changing the constitution, and not through what we call a constitutional assembly. How do you call that? Asamblea Constituyente. Yeah, constitutional assembly. Constitutional assemblies, and so it's not only about the content, it's about the way in which you pursue it. Constitutional assemblies have been tried in countries with severe crisis. Chile is, nothing of the sort to try a constitutional assembly. Plus the fact that it creates a huge uncertainty at times that we need to be creating confidence and certainty in people, and we don't know what these constitutional changes will be, but what we do know is that we'll be, furthering the idea of social rights as opposed to property rights, to limit property rights with social rights. And there will be a social right to education, social right to work. What does that mean? Freedom of work? Freedom of work is enshrined in our constitution right now. So, then this is all from the program and from the government program of President Bachelet, because we don't know what the constitutional, we don't have a bill in front of us, we don't have, a clear idea of what will happen, but what comes from the program, at least from the economic side, is extremely worrying. And I would also challenge, I think any constitutional change should happen within our institutional framework, and not with another kind of, constitutional assembly, which will create a major, major uncertainty. And at times when societies are, I should say, if they're in a bad mood or not, but, if constitutional assembly can go, anywhere. So I think it would be a very delicate thing.
Eugenio Tironi, is the Constitutional Assembly, is this an idea whose time must wait?
I think that the constitutional issue is more actual than in this day than 2 or 3 months ago. But the issue changed. The problem is not, as Felipe said, to throw up the Pinochet's legacy. I would say the issues of the 20th century. But today the goal is how to have an institutional framework to deal with corruption and privileges. So that is the main issue of all democracies in the 21st century. And the commission President Bachelet created to propose changes in this area, the Engel Commission, is in some sense a constitutional assembly, an informal constitutional assembly, because it's going to propose probably, as Juan Gabriel and Ambassador Valdez said before, a very radical measures that will change completely the Chilean landscape, political landscape, and also how business are done in Chile. And political parties had agreed in the last days to approve in a fast track these propositions that will and they will probably amputate, they will cut a lot of power from the South. So I think we are facing very important changes in our constitutional or institutional framework without a Asamblea Constitucional. That was something that was in the some people were frightened about that. People believed that that was the magical solution for everything. Huh? But I think that the crisis, the scandals, opened the possibility, incredibly, but opened the possibility of huge changes in the political institutions without passing through a constitutional assembly, but through this Engel Commission.
Very interesting. I'm going to want to open it up to, we only have 25 minutes left, so I want to open it up to a number of questions. I've left the issue of corruption out of our discussion because I presume it's going to come from somebody in the audience. And why don't we begin with the gentleman in the back who quickly raised his hand. Would you just stand up and identify yourself, please? And
Hello, my name is Jose Miguel Pulido. I work for Mitsui & Co. Thank you very much for the great presentations. I was wondering, it seems that the depression in commodity prices has an extremely negative impact on Chilean growth, and it has not been touched on during the presentation. I'm curious as to how that will continue to impact the inequality trajectories and how, in turn, that will continue to impact the political landscape. Thank you.
why don't I give it to you first?
No, only he.
¿Tú lo quieres esa?
He says, no, only to you. This is commodity prices. Well, interestingly, I think, well, Chile, first of all, as you know, Chile is highly dependent on copper. You know, over 50% of our exports are copper. Still, we have diversified, but still 50% of copper. China is our main trading partner. 25% of Chilean exports go to China. Among almost 50% to Asia. And the fact that copper prices have dropped, you know, is certainly has an effect on the Chilean economy. But at the same time, oil prices have collapsed. You know, while copper prices have dropped, oil prices have collapsed, and we import over 95% of our liquid energy needs. So we have been extremely favored by the collapse of oil prices and hurt by the decline of copper prices. We'll have to, you know, calculate. We're probably a little hurt, you know. So, but then we have our currency that depreciates. To exactly consider that, so part of the depreciation of the Chilean currency comes from the fact that we have to consider that our terms of trade have declined. You know, we don't have but this is a generalized thing. I think the Chilean economy is strong enough to withstand the current reduction of copper prices. If you're telling me that copper prices will go to $1.50, that's a different story. But nobody's really forecasting that. We have accumulated, and this is a policy that goes beyond our government. It comes from, 2000, the policy of the structural fiscal rule and the sovereign funds, which have accumulated, and we can take from those funds in the times which are not so prosperous in terms of commodity markets. So I think the Chilean economy has all the possibilities to withstand and to be able to live with this new reality of commodity markets, but that depends on the policies that are done internally. You know, it's not an automatic pilot that you say, okay, you know, you have low commodity prices and then Chilean economy will immediately adjust. No, it depends. You may be doing a lot of things to the economy which are not good, you know, and which, the Chilean economy is strong, but then you're saddling it with burdens on other areas, which will complicate our ability to resume strong growth.
Let me take a question here. This gentleman on the right. Is there a...
My name is Joaquin Molina. I'm normal Chilean, so...
That's a good thing.
Yeah, so I would like to ask...
We'll try to be normal here.
Excuse me, because my English is not my first language, so if I want to talk with...
Please, go ahead.
These people in English is not going to be the same, but there's two things here, like a normal Chilean. First, I thought that this forum gonna be about the political crisis that living right now Chile. And when I'm sitting here, I'm hearing about how is Chile and how it's growing. So, and the second thing is, when I'm here, what I'm hearing is I found that it's a different Chile that I know. I'm not feel represented for what I'm hearing here. So I have to divide my question in two. One is economics for Mr. Larraín, and one is political for Mr. Tironi. First, the economical, because I've been
You're
here.
going to get one question, sir. Why don't you ask
Okay,
the
okay,
political
I'll try
one?
to mix it.
There's a lot of people. So.
Okay, but I'll try to. But in this case, I'll be in political. I'm not going to be in economics. Sorry, it's about taxes. But I feel here that Chile is in a crisis because I found or see that there's two oligarchies. One is empresarial oligarchy, another is a political oligarchy. And the people disagree with what happened right now because they don't feel that the rules are fair. You know?
Okay, let's get Mr. Tironi to answer that question. So I think have we not done a good enough job to describe the political crisis that today exists in Chile? And if we haven't, please do it.
No, if you in Chile we are very alarmed about because political parties or Congress and President are not popular and people don't have confidence in them. But if we compare the situation with the U.S. or Europe, not to say Argentina or Peru or Brazil, then the situation is not so different. People have better, but has least confidence in institutions and in the elite when they have more confidence in themselves. So this is a good sign and not a bad sign. Secondly, the way that Chileans reacted to corruption or to all these kind of things, most of them are not new and are not people who are getting rich themselves. It's for politics, for the common good. But the way this was normal, but as it happened with inequality, in some moment of what was normal in the past is not normal anymore. That's the problem with the priests also, and so now. People are scandalized, but are not cynical, are not indifferent. So the reaction of the people and the reaction also of institutions, of the prosecutors, of the press, is a sign of very healthy society. And what I explained before, the idea of creating this commission, and give the carte blanche to the Commission to do anything they want, with the Communist Party inside. I think, and with the Communist Party signing also this agreement to give a fast track to their propositions, it's showing that we don't have a political institutional crisis in Chile, as Ambassador Valdez said. And I will not say that we have really a political crisis. We have a society, but that is showing much more stronger than it was before. And I agree. And the elite or the oligarchy must adapt to this new reality. And that takes time and makes a lot of people unhappy.
This gentleman there had a question.
Good. Thank you very much. I'm visiting Johns Hopkins SIS from Korea, Wonho Kim. In the beginning, former Minister Larraín mentioned middle income trap. In this discussion, highly discussed whether it is a political crisis or an institutional crisis. But anyway, I tend to understand the point middle income trap as saying that this is a structural problem. That remind me of Korean experience in 1990s. We had an intensive discussion about the mid-1990s crisis, and finally we saw financial crisis 1997, 1998. So my question is, if you understand it is a middle income trap, then the situation now is all that we can see from middle income trap in Chile, or are we going to see some worse situation if the problem is not well addressed? Thank you. Yeah, this question can go to former Minister Larraín or Dr. Eugenio.
Well, first of all, I said that middle income trap is one of the two issues, but not the only one. I mentioned the second, but just for the brevity of the answer, I think it's an issue because if you think, well, part of the issues that if you go back to 2011 and you saw the student movement, and the student movement was saying free education, that was basically, and we said in the government, no, and we made progress, in scholarships and loans and loan costs, as I mentioned, and expanded the education budget by about 50%, so that 20% of the, roughly 20% of the whole public budget goes now to education. Which is a pretty high number, And it started as second or third when we started our government, and then, it went up as a proportion of the total and in absolute terms. But the issue is that how do you deal with it? The question is not that the middle income trap exists. I think it has been documented to exist. The question is how you deal with it. Do you deal with it and say, okay, we're going to appease all sectors that are demanding they're part of the pie, say, well, where's my part, and well, but you have some duties as well. No, I don't want any duties. I want to have free education. Not minding that these people that are going to go out of higher education, after they leave higher education, are going to have some of the income levels which are, at the very top of the Chilean income scale. So, I mean, the problem to me is that if we try to appease the movements that are demanding for this type of things and say, okay, free education, yes, okay, free education. And then we go to a different group. And this is a little bit the idea of the social rights, which I think there should be social rights. The question is, what are the social rights? How do we define them? Do we go to the judiciary to define those? Or is it clearly stated in the Constitution? And I think it is those kind of questions and the way we solve them that will determine whether Chile can continue, growing and solve this problem well, or just, go around and grow very little and go back to some, very unhealthy rates of growth. One final point is that I am not so optimistic about the Engel Commission as Eugenio is. Saying that this will be or replace the Constitutional Assembly, I hope it produces good results in terms of, and I agree with the idea of a commission because a commission provides time for thinking, provides time for people of different parts of the political spectrum from different realities, and different activities to sort of bring them together and to propose a solution to the country. And I regret that this commission has so little time, to decide. They gave them 45 days, which is a very, very short period of time. But
anyway. Felipe said before that if I can prove, I have evidence about that inequalities is being broken by political power. I remember Lenin, and I think that the middle income trap is not only economic; it's mainly institutional and political, and that and in the Chilean case, I think what we are living are the institutional and political challenges of a middle-income country, and that means money and politics, how to finance politics, how to prevent influence trafficking, how to prevent the use of private information to make business, how to prevent abusing of minority investors, and how to prevent creating networks of political support to do business in regulatory sectors that are highly regulated. That was the case of Penta. How do you prevent collision? How do the collision in some industries? That's the case of collusion. So these are all the things that are in the agenda of the Engel Commission. And the Engel Commission is not only about politics; it's about business. And I think if politicians, as I said before, they agreed to give a fast track to their proposition. So we are in this moment facing a huge change on the way the oligarchy governs, and I hope that this will prevent the problems of the so-called middle-income countries.
Let me take a couple of questions at a time, if I could. The lady in the front row. I'm going to take a couple. So.
Sure. Thank you. I'm Gabrielle Trebot with TIRONI Associates here in D.C. We've talked a lot about education reform and constitutional reform, and I'd be interested to get your thoughts. Given the current political environment with Pentagate and Caso Caval, what are your thoughts on the likelihood of the second wave of reforms that Bachelet has discussed as priorities? I'm thinking here pension reform, reform of the ISAPRES healthcare system. Is there going to be space for a meaningful conversation on these important parts of Chile and the rest of her tenure?
Yes, thank you. Another question? Gentleman back there.
Igor Salles from the World Bank. Actually, just want to expand the question. Is if you can talk specifically about higher education reform, what's going to be the likelihood given the decline of the support after the primary and secondary reform was made?
One more. Margaret?
Thank you very much. You've talked about the commodity issue, but there are commentaries that suggest that Chile needs really to invest in diversification of its economy, so it's not dependent 50% on exports and so forth. To what extent is that economic diversification part of the discussion these days?
Thank you. So I think there's two sets of questions. One set of questions clearly is, let's explore the reform issue a little bit longer. And, is there political capacity to implement these reforms given the stagnant state of the economy, or does really the government, with the time left in this government, really have to concentrate on more economic-related issues rather than reforms? Though pension reform certainly is an economic-related issue, but all of these things take a lot of capital, a lot of political capital away. So why don't I begin with you, Eugenio, and then I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about diversification.
I think that the government learned the lesson last year about the idea of promoting changes with radical methods and ideas. Secondly, the government doesn't have the political capacity to undergo those kinds of reforms now. And the opposition changed completely. All the hardline, the hawks in the opposition are out of the scene. And now we have a new president, leader of the UDI, the most Pinochet-oriented right, that is willing to have agreements with the government. So we need to dance to make. And now I think there is a great opportunity to find agreements between opposition and government to some kind of reforms. I am sure that that the new educational reforms are going to be agreed. And I will bet that the labor reform that's being discussed in the parliament it's going to find some kind of agreement. Not to create jobs, because that's not, or growth, but that's not the goal of that reform. That reform is oriented to give more power to labor and underdo what was done by the Plan Laboral, that expropriates rights from labor and gave them to capital. And what is promoting this law is not in any way different than what you find in the OECD countries. But the price is going to moderate because of the discussion in Congress. I don't think there's much more space for any other reform, like pensions or health, no. Because the institutional agenda against corruption, to put or I would say the constitutional agenda of the 21st century, plus the teachers' careers and demunicipalization, we call it, in education, plus labor reforms, that's done.
So that's the short term. The long term in terms of diversifying the economy?
No, but I'll first take on the reform agenda. First thing about these reforms is I tend to agree that there's significantly less political capital to pursue other types of reforms. In a way, if these reforms were going to be crafted in the way that we saw the first reforms of this government, I'm happy, that this is happening, because, all these reforms, I would make a difference with the tax reform and the labor reform. Labor reform was more, was more dialogue. In the tax reform, no dialogue, done in a room, only a few guys, and then full of problems in Congress. So I hope that, if we get additional reforms, that we get more consensus building, which has been absent, pretty much absent, from the current state of reforms, and which shows in the very poor quality of the reforms that have been presented to Congress by the government. On the issue of a labor reform right now, which is really not a labor reform, it's been called a union reform, because it's, as you say, it's a pro-union. On our calculations, it will destroy about 150,000 jobs. But the issue is to give more power to unions. So if we agree, fine. It will cost 150,000 jobs. Of course, these figures, this is not discussed publicly, much, because the limelight is on another issue. When you say going to the OECD levels, unionization rate in Chile is 15.3. In the OECD level, average is 16.9. So what are we talking about here? It's really, of course, we are very far from Scandinavian countries whose unionization rates are on top of 60%. 60, 65, even 70% unionization rates. But that's a very, very, peculiar situation in the world. We have higher unionization rates than the United States, for example, in Chile. So I hope that, we can build a more of a consensus. By the way, I cannot stop commenting on the issue that you said that the tax reform was approved with a important part of votes from the opposition. Sure, because what was presented was a terrible reform, and then it was basically a way to, reduce the damage to the economy, and some things were improved to leave a terrible reform only as a very bad reform. That was so, and in the process, you had to get some kind of, negotiation that I hope starts before. That we will get.
At least in Chile, you negotiate. In our parliament, they don't talk to each other. Nothing happens.
Yeah. Well,
it's a marked improvement.
Yeah, it's a marked improvement. Yeah.
Why don't you go to the issue of diversification?
Yeah. Let me say it different. I think it's very doubtful that we will get an agreement on higher education reform. Very doubtful that we will get. So that would be my prediction. I think that it's so different. The views here and on diversification, I think it's a big issue. We have diversified. In the beginning of the 70s, the Chilean economy, 75% of our exports were copper. So we're now at 50. But what are we going to do? We have been blessed with a lot of copper. Are we going to leave it underground? You know, it's a complication. But we've been growing in copper, and we've been growing more on other sectors. The very fact that we have a floating rate, a floating exchange rate, will help diversify. But this is not the only thing. R&D credits for, you know, for different sectors. A very interesting thing in Chile, which is not only agriculture. In agriculture, we should do much more, and we could do much more to be one of the prime providers of, you know, foodstuff to the world economy. But services that are traded, you know, internationally, helped by information technologies and financial services, that we have a leadership in Chile in the provision, for example, of fund management, you know, that we could provide for foreigners. And I think those are areas that we need to, it's not only because you think of Chile, you think of copper, and you think of salmon, and you think of fruit and wine. You know, and keep thinking of that, please. But but the other thing is, you know, we need to do more to expand our base. Sure.
You have a plane to catch.
That's right.
So I wanted to thank all of you, and thank in particular Felipe Larraín. Thank you.